CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, from the CHEK News World Headquarters satellite office in my living room, where we are recording due to the pandemic, which hopefully is kind of going to change up a little bit. We'll come up with some different recording formats for you in the weeks ahead. We got a great show this week. If you're listening, thank you for listening. If you're watching, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. We've got audio extras for you. If you're on TV, there's past episodes here of the show on the CHEK Plus app for free that you'll want to check out. Let's bring in the panel. You know them from each and every week. We have Jillian, we have Jeff, we have Maclean. Katie's off this week, but we'll be back soon. Let's go to our first topic. I know I looked you in the eye last week and I said, no more COVID, but I lied. I lied straight to your face, because here we are doing COVID again. The BC government announced a review this week, a 3-person panel to get into the emergency preparedness, cross-ministry communication of the pandemic. The report is expected this fall. I think it's notable also for what is not included, and that is any public health decisions made by Dr. Bonnie Henry. So things like masks, vaccines, vaccine cards, booster doses, all of those kind of decisions. And also, no economic aid is going to be part of this package. So government's decisions on rent and subsidies and that type of thing, billions that were spent there. So the opposition BC Liberals came out, called this a laughable exercise. There's probably still some merit to doing it. Jeff, let's bring you in first. Good, bad, the right kind of mix, balance. How do we put the context of this review out for people to understand?
It's a serious exercise. It's an important exercise. It's a needed exercise. Look, there will be a time for health reviews. There will be time for economic reviews. But doing that now, while we're still in the middle of COVID, is like reviewing a movie 2/3 of the way in. You'll get some good insights, but you'd do a better job if you waited until you've seen the whole movie. Look, we're in a serious situation in the world today. We're in the crucible of epidemics, of climate disaster. We've seen that in BC, and war. And if we fail to prepare for what's coming our way, we should prepare to fail. And that's not something any British Columbian wants. So look, this review will look at BC's emergency preparedness, give us information we need to become better prepared to protect people and communities, as the terms of reference say, for future emergencies of all kinds. I think it's the right time, a good scope, and there will be time for health and economy down the road.
I always review movies 2/3 of the way through, Jeff, and also the latest Batman movie, 10 out of 10, 2/3 of the way through and at the end. So that's my movie review on that. Make sure you check it out. Big Batman fan here. Jillian, I think that maybe part of the issue might be here that government didn't really put any context on this. It wrote this press release in what seemed like a vacuum in space, said, here's our pandemic review, and shot it out. There were no lines that said there's more reviews coming, or as Jeff pointed out, doing a public health review and still when we're in the pandemic maybe doesn't make sense right now. But none of that was in there. It was just kind of, hey, we announced our COVID review, here you go. Did that, kind of hamper this, or what other context is there for this review, do you think?
Yeah, I think they certainly could have staved off a lot of criticism had they done exactly what you said and included a line or two about, forthcoming inquiries into the other big parts of the pandemic, because those are significant. All of the public health decisions, all of the economic recovery, which was one of the things that they faced the greatest criticism over, the ineffective supports for small businesses in the tourism sector earlier in the pandemic, which I think is critical that we do look at those. We don't know what exactly happened here. It could have been just got missed by the government comms, and this was sort of just a routine thing, or it could be that they don't know the extent to which they want to pick apart those things. So far the government has enjoyed pretty high approval ratings for its handling of the pandemic, and I think it's understandable that they wouldn't want to pick that apart. But I think it is critical that we do do that. And I think, the other thing is that we don't, like, it's become slowly clear that COVID isn't going to have a clear end date like we thought it would when we all got vaccinated. And so, it makes sense to wait until maybe we're out of the woods a little bit more, but we also need to recognize that that might not happen and that we do need to learn those lessons at some point.
Yeah, it's a balancing act between, is it ever going to be over, and when can you review it, and when's a good time to do that, use the resources in the right way. Maclean, it seems like the opposition is going to have a field day on this. There is, in fact, in the terms of reference, no recommendations being produced by this report, just a summary of a review, not any recommendations on how to improve. I guess government has to infer that from whatever else is in there. Is this a gift to the opposition Liberals and other critics, do you think?
The public and the opposition will be forgiven for suspecting that once the government has done this review, excluding what it's excluding, that there will not be a second review. There are usually not two reviews on the same subject, even if fairly major and substantial areas are purposefully ignored on the first time. And so, yes, there's every reason to be suspicious that those other reviews that we seem to be hinting will come down the road will never happen. And I would quibble with the analogy of a movie. I haven't seen Batman, by the way, but at least that movie will end. It's 3 hours. It's whatever. You can look at the end time when you go in. We have been comparing COVID to a war, which more or less from the beginning, using the same language in the same terms. And that's kind of apt in that you also don't know when those are going to end. And just because you haven't finished the fight doesn't mean it's not a good reason to look at what has worked and what hasn't worked. Jillian has pointed to some of the hiccups and mistakes with small business supports. Rob, you wrote a column that the government was in a position of not being able to give away free money. Of course this should be looked at because we don't know when the pandemic will end. If we need to put these supports back in place again, we'll want to know how to make them more effective. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about making things quicker and better if we have to do this again in the fall or next year.
Yeah, but it also is about pointing fingers too, I think, because that's politics as well.
Yeah, it is exactly about pointing fingers. And having been in an opposition staffer before, I know that there's no scope to any inquiry that is good enough. You want it expanded so that you can hold the government accountable for everything. And I saw one Liberal MLA this week blame the Premier, I think in jest, but you never know, for a baby crying. So the opposition likes to blame government for everything. But I think on the panel, we agree that there's value in understanding and learning from the lessons of what's happened here. The challenge with public inquiries and complex public inquiries into public health issues, and you look at the inquiry that happened in Ontario around the SARS, that started in 2013 and it wrapped up with the final report going to government in 2017. We have some clear and present dangers that we're facing right now in terms of climate, epidemic, and you hear things coming out of Vladimir Putin's mouth and they're scary and we need to be prepared. And I don't want to wait 3 years to get to work on those. There'll be a time for health and time for economy, but for goodness sake, we're looking down at some real big challenges, and it's smart to look at our emergency preparedness to see how ready we are.
Yeah, public inquiries are legendary for costing a ton of money and taking years and producing several really large reports that just fill up a filing cabinet in the basement of some government ministry, and we never look at them again. But I think there's a fundamental question I want to go back around on again, and Jillian touched on this, and I think the fundamental question we might be dancing around is, does government want to review the decisions made by Dr. Bonnie Henry? And I think there are a lot of critics out there, some critics, who would love to string her up like a piñata and start kind of whacking away at all the decisions she made, second-guessing her, exercising their own grudges and miseries from their lives and how hard the pandemic was on her in retrospect. I don't think Premier John Horgan wants to do that. I don't think Health Minister Adrian Dix wants to do that. I think they've been supportive of everything that she's decided and given her that space. But how do you construct a review that is respectful, that is comprehensive, that is impartial, that is fair? When do you do it? Do you do it? And that maybe is one of the reasons why that's not even alluded to in here, because government hasn't wrestled with that fundamental question. Jillian, is that something that we should be doing? Is it more of a, for example, federal government issue where it approved the vaccines from Health Canada. It bought the vaccines, it bought the PPE, it sent them out, it produced larger guidelines. Is BC waiting for that maybe? Or how do we wrap our heads around whether going back at Dr. Henry's decisions is productive and is politically useful, or is even useful in general?
Well, I mean, I think what I'm most interested in is actually the interplay between, the decisions made by Dr. Henry and the Public Health Office and the government, because I think that it's been a little bit opaque in BC, what the interplay between, where the lines are. And I think that that's a really important information for the public to know and understand what works and what they need to be holding the government accountable for, when it comes time for the next election. I think that, yeah, I agree. I think Dr. Henry has a lot on her plate. She is still managing the pandemic, as we've discussed. She's also managing another toxic drug crisis, pandemic and many other serious things that have, gotten actually worse, a mental health crisis during the pandemic. So she's got a lot on her plate, and subjecting her to, a review of that nature, I think needs to be carefully considered in terms of the timing and the scope, and make sure that it is effective and not just an exercise in blame.
Yeah, it needs to be, you're right, carefully considered. You don't want a bunch of unqualified, unrelated physicians who started up a group pretending to do that during the pandemic, coming in and using their unrelated academic credentials to criticize Dr. Henry in a false equivalency. It needs to be done in a way by someone who's qualified, or people who are qualified, if we even do it at all in Maclean. Is that the fundamental question we're kind of dancing around here when government starts to review this pandemic? Is that you get too far down a road and you're into Dr. Henry's territory? And the public, by and large, polls have shown, think she did a good job in a no-win situation that none of them would want to be in, and they're generally happy with what she's done.
I agree with that completely. I think that it's important to separate the two main things that are being excluded from this review. On the one hand, you have Dr. Henry's decisions, and I agree. I think there is less value in having three public officials, bureaucrats mostly, review epidemiology. That doesn't make any sense to me. And there will be scientific papers written about BC and every other jurisdiction's response. These will fill journals for decades to come, and there's probably less reason to duplicate that. On the other hand, economic decisions made by this provincial government and only this provincial government are absolutely worthy of review and could be done by some of the people that are doing this review. It is not a distraction from the operations of the provincial government. We're talking about three people that don't work for the provincial government. This is not a significant drain on Bonnie Henry, Adrian Dix, John Horgan, anybody. They could absolutely be looking at what worked and what didn't work about some of these support programs, which mostly did work. No one's accusing the government of completely botching this. But again, if we want to make it even better, if we have to do this again in months, years, decades down the road, I would like to know how.
Yeah, the Auditor General is reviewing, I think, pandemic spending and economic aid programs. So that might be a good vehicle for that review to happen. But I agree with you. Some of the programs and some of the money has to be accounted for. We pushed billions of dollars out the door in record time with, a small group of legislators just kind of agreeing in a day or two to get it out. It's probably worth having a second look on how that was done.
I just want to get back to your original question, and I'll do it very, very brief. Does the government have an interest in doing a health and a review and an economic review? Will they do it? Yes, they will.
Well, let's move on to the minimum wage, which was another announcement the government made this week, that the minimum wage is being raised to $15.65 an hour. That's a 45-cent increase, or a 2.8% increase. The government's saying it's going to be tied to inflation in the future. The minimum wage has gone up more than $5 in the last 10 years. It's now the highest amongst Canadian provinces. The balance here obviously is dealing with a labor shortage and a staffing shortage in a lot of industries, paying a somewhat livable wage, with small businesses recovering from the pandemic and struggling to maybe afford that as well. Let's go around on this. Jillian, is this the right balance? Has government gone far enough here, and is it the right move?
Certainly, I think tying the minimum wage to inflation makes sense. Lower income people tend to get hit by inflationary pressures harder in many cases. So I think that this makes sense. It also, I like it because it takes the politics out of minimum wage discussions. It's pegged to inflation. It goes up in accordance to the cost of living. I think that's positive. Minimum wage has gone up a lot since the NDP formed government with the support of the Greens in 2017, but I think that's because it was frozen so low for so long, and it was long overdue. There is another report forthcoming, which is sort of like the legacy of that alliance between the NDP and the Greens, a Fair Wages Commission report, which is a group of economists and representatives from business and labor that are supposed to be reporting on closing the gap between minimum wage and living wage, because as we know, the living wage in most parts of BC is, $5 or $6 higher than even this now higher minimum wage. And I think, it is something that we need to have a serious conversation about, because we know that the cost of keeping people below the living wage is expensive for society as well in other ways, whether it's health, mental health, other kinds of supports that people have to rely on to get by. So I think it is going to be really interesting to see how the government responds to that report and the recommendations that come out of it, because even with these big increases in the last couple of years, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, Labour Minister Harry Bains did say he's waiting for those recommendations, and that'll inform kind of the future of the minimum wage. But at this point, Jeff, tying it to inflation with all the affordability pressures people are facing seems like a good move. But did the government hit that right balance, do you think?
I think we're in a good spot. Among the provinces, BC will have the highest minimum wage. I think some of the territories might be a little bit higher. I'm all for a boost for British Columbians who have to often work multiple jobs, long hours to pay for basic necessities, and even still have to make difficult choices. The thing that I'm most heartened by, as someone who back in the day did a stunt where me and a politician skated 800 laps of a rink in minus 30 weather to get an $8 minimum wage. And I got really bad hypothermia, and he almost lost his big toe. But what makes me happy is that the argument that higher minimum wage means fewer jobs has been exposed as phony as a Tom Brady retirement announcement. Look in BC right now. Employment's up, a whole bunch of new jobs last month, more jobs than before the pandemic, more people employed in BC's history. There's still more work to do to bring the minimum wage up to a living wage. And it's not a living wage in any part of the province, but it's a step in the right direction, and it's as Jillian said, this kind of policy move is long overdue.
Wait a second, did you actually skate 800 laps? And if so, did you get the $8 minimum wage? Did you achieve your goal?
We between the two of us, we skated the 800 laps. We didn't get it then, but we forced the government's hand, and we got the minimum wage up to past $10. So
was that here?
Good. Nah, that was in Ontario.
Okay.
Sorry, folks on the TV. Dirty Ontario guy.
Is there any video of that? We're gonna have to check for video. We'll just overlay that over top of your face if there's some video of that. I assume spandex and the whole gear.
Not pretty.
Okay. No, all right. Well, maybe we'll save the viewers.
Orange hockey shirts. Okay. Orange hockey shirts. That's about it.
Right. Maclean, I think some people might be looking at this and saying, hey, 2.8% is, I thought inflation was 5%. And it's true. Inflation reached a 30-year high this week at 5%, but BC's using an average of 2021's inflation, which started at like 0.9%. So it's artificially driving it down to reach, I think, what it considers a better balance for businesses and workers than 5%. Maybe, I don't know. What do you make of the numbers here?
I'll choose my words carefully, because I know that whatever I say, the B-roll will be Jeff in a speed skater outfit. So I want to make sure not to contrast too sharply. You're absolutely right. There's more than one way to track inflation, and BC did kind of pick the lower one in this case. It's provincial inflation, which is a justifiable choice. Look, I at the risk of sounding like we all agree, I think tying it to inflation was actually the right move and a smart move. The one thing that it's important to watch, though, is that when most people talk about business, especially in BC, and especially here in Victoria, they tend to have, Chip Wilson, Lululemon in their mind's eye. And that's not who employs people in BC. And while I would never begrudge anyone a pay hike, and there is no but here, we do need to keep an eye on small businesses, which employ more British Columbians than any other sector, because they are facing a squeeze.